Warning. The following video contains strong language that some viewers may find offensive or disturbing.
Redditors who lived in countries that no longer exist, like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, etc. What was it like to see your country break up? My parents lived in Bosnia before the Yugoslavian war. They finished building their family home for them and my siblings who were babies back then in 1988 or 1989. And now imagine being forced to move away from your newly built life with two young children a year later. I was born in Austria in 1992 and I remember being poor as a child. Poor but happy. My mother's educational degrees were not to be found, were not accepted in Austria, basically restricting her possible jobs to being a cleaning lady after being the manager of a Yugoslavian market chain. I remember the first time we visited the old house after the war in 1998 I think. I remember seeing the house full of bullet holes. One corner of the house blown away by tank grenades. I remember finding my brother's old toys trampled into the dirt in the front yard. I remember my mother finding an old dress of hers in their former bedroom, hardened by the exposure to the elements. I vividly remember her sitting on the stairs in front of the main entrance, silently crying. My point is, it is often not so much about seeing your country break apart, but much rather about seeing the life, dreams and hopes you left behind rot like the old green velvet dress she loved so much. Sorry for mobile upload. When Czechoslovakia separated into Czech Republic and Slovak Republic, I was quite young and had no idea what was going on. Then suddenly, they started teaching us slightly different geography at school, but apart from that and a few bitter remarks from some adults. That was all. What I do remember, though, is that almost all the textbooks we got in school were written in the time of Czechoslovakia and no one bothered to change them for up-to-date versions. So we were often asked to cross out Czechoslovakia from the text and write Czech Republic above it, or draw a thick line between Czech and Slovak republics in a map. That was during the first 9 years of school, at least. Otherwise, I think Czechs and Slovaks have still quite the brotherly relationship. For example, there is a huge amount of Slovak students in Czech universities, who later stay to work. I lived in Moscow before the USSR got dissolved. One thing that was jarring in the aftermath was the emergence of a lot of Western chains we previously had no exposure to. I remember going to my first McDonald's in 1991. A funny anecdote I heard is that the service staff had to be trained to act more friendly, like they would in American restaurants. To be fair, it was a stressful and uncertain period. I was born at the end of the Bosnian War, 1995. Following the breakup of Yugoslavia, CCA 1992. So I can't remember the breakup. But I remember the post-breakup, post-war years, having very little money. The city, Sarajevo, was bombed to shit. And 95% of buildings either had bullet holes or were torn down. I remember watching German channels like Togo, and all the cool toys the German kids had, that you couldn't buy in my country at the time. My dad drove a Yugo 55, Google it. The bodywork on that car was full of shrapnel holes, he replaced the engine. Later, my dad did the bodywork on the car himself. But he didn't have money for car paint, so he painted it with paint used for mailboxes. No supermarkets, only small stores and markets. Now the country looks and feels like any other European country. But back then it was a whole different story. We emigrated from the USSR about a year before it broke up. So technically I'm a Soviet. What makes everything more complicated is that we're from Crimea, which was recently annexed by Russia. I opened a new bank account a while back and one of the details I had to fill is where I'm originally from. It was an electronic with a menu. No option to select USSR and pick either Ukraine or Russia would be taking a political standpoint. It was a very weird experience. I was born in the USSR 2 months before it collapsed, so I don't personally remember anything, but my parents do. Everything was basically chaos. Most of the businesses that were previously funded by the government had no chance of competing with Western businesses, so many of them went bankrupt, and that meant that lots of people including my father lost their jobs. And lots of unemployment then led to lots of crime. The 90s were a crazy time full of riots, crimes and violence in many former Soviet countries. I had a foreign exchange student from Latvia. He said his family made a lot of money because they sold a tank left on their property. I was born in Yugoslavia. Mid-80s. It was sad. I lived in a major city largely untouched by direct attack. But we had all three major ethnicities heavily represented, and it was incredibly confusing as to why friends stopped being friends. Families broke up, etc. As kids we understood what was happening, but not why. I remember hiding my next-door Muslim neighbor when the military police came. I remember being embarrassed of who I was, even though my family lineage has mixed roots. I remember weeks without electricity, without running water, doing homework by candlelight, military rations, 1 bottle of oil to last months. Flour was scarce. The river would carry sounds of gunfire and explosions. I saw my dad only a few times in 5 years. Afterwards I remember thinking that was lucky. Some didn't see their dads at all. I remember my dad spending what little time he had at home teaching me how to use various guns. Just in case. Afterwards, some people lost their minds. One of the soldiers was convinced the enemy was still there, ever present. He would place small explosives that looked like canned food in the cupboards where his wife and kids were, in his mind to protect them. A couple drank themselves to death. I always believed they died in the forest outside the town years ago. Businesses closed. Factories were empty. There was still work for some, but no pay. The currency was worthless. You'd get paid sometimes, in the morning, and by the afternoon it wasn't even enough for a roll of toilet paper. Weird, scary times. Air raid sirens would interrupt soccer games. I remember wondering why I couldn't see some of my friends. Explanations back then didn't make sense. They still don't. For the people that lived, worked and played together, we never wanted that shit. It was pushed on us, manipulated us, played to our fears and insecurities. Maybe it would have happened eventually regardless. I was born just around the dissolution of Czechoslovakia, but I have heard from many people who experienced it that it was very peaceful. Basically, Slovakia wanted their own state because they are a separate nation and their language is different, though we understand each other. And they also were not thrilled that all the political decisions were being made in Prague. So Slovakia was a bit forgotten at times. Our two countries still have very good relationships, and although we make fun of each other, we are buddies. A family friend grew up in East Germany. When she's had too much to drink, she gets very nostalgic about it and even sheds some tears. She is very defensive of East Germany and says that as a child it was amazing. Another family friend is from Czech Republic, and my boyfriend and his brother are from Slovakia, all born before the split. None of these guys seem to care. They say it's still just the same to them. My husband was born in the GDR, East Germany. And although he is ambivalent about the positives and negatives of the system, he is still sad to effectively not be able to return to the country he grew up in. Nothing is the same there since the collapse of communism. There is a name for that feeling in Germany: Ostalgie. Ost means east in German. Breaking Czechia from Slovakia wasn't a big deal. In the shadow of the fall of the communism, one day they were simply gone like a lover in the morning, and that was all right. My dad and my uncles had to literally fight in a war to gain freedom. We were called East Pakistan. Now it's called Bangladesh. The war happened in 1971. My dad and others like him are called freedom fighters. And every time we asked, he says although he's happy that we won our freedom, but he cries at the awful things he saw. Women, children raped. People being tortured. They themselves had to torture Pakistani soldiers to get information about their bases. It's traumatic. But I guess the result was good. I was born and still live in one of the ex-Yugoslav republics, Slovenia. I was 3 months old when we declared independence. so I don't remember how the country's fragmented. But I do remember the Bosnian War and the influx of refugees. Altaf, I didn't really understand it as a kid. The thing that personally affected me the most about the dissolution of Yugoslavia were the constantly shifting maps. Every year in school we had new maps and each one was different when you looked at the area of Serbia. The reason I am writing this is because the whole Yugoslav past still has far-reaching consequences in our lives. Mainly in the political spheres. Many politicians who were around at the time of the breakup are still active. And the people are hardly divided about the Yugoslav past of the country. Some suffered during the socialist era, and some prospered. Some see it as a great time and some view it as this horrible oppressive regime. It's especially bad when the time immediately after WW2 is brought up. Bekwa say that was the time of, well, changes and horrible actions from the new government's side. And naturally, the politicians try to appeal to one of those groups. It's come to the point where these types of things eclipse every actual problem in the country. There are issues with our public health care? Well, who cares? The opposition to the reforms are communists. And suddenly that's what everyone talks about. There are issues with taxing the independent workers? Sure, but have you heard about a statue that was unveiled for victims of after-war killings? That's what we should talk about. Every single issue is swept away by just shifting the focus to something that happened in the time of Yugoslavia. And who did what and who deserves to be punished. And people who actually lived through those times just eat that shit up. Especially the boomers. 'Cause they were directly impacted by the end of the war. So my story is like a breakup that didn't happen. But some 55 years later it's still bitter. So Maldives. Small islands in the Indian Ocean no one knew about. Especially back then cause no tourism. We are made up many atolls, and atoll is a group of islands. In our case it's about 200 small islands on average in an atoll. All the atolls are scattered. Interestingly, atoll is from the Maldivian word, athalu anyways after the Brits left us. Because they are so good at protecting lol. There was tension between the three southernmost and the rest of the country. South was economically prospering but they didn't want to pay taxes to the government. The Brits armed the southerners. But the South didn't want to take arms against their brothers. They made a republic of Suvadivs. Government heard about it. And there was a lot of tension but no civil war. People were displaced. The main island, which was the economic capital, got ransacked. That's where my grandmother is from. Recently I went there for work. And told them I'm the grandson of her. So people welcomed me as their own. It's like everyone has a lot to say against the people from the capital. There's still hostility in their minds. But the times have changed. A majority of the people live in Male capital, however they still really want independence. On another note, documents from the British Foreign Ministry shows that their intention was to make a British military base in the south. Since they couldn't do it, they did it to our neighbors. Diego Garcia. Pretty much a takeover. Sent the people to a different country on boats and they still live in poverty. On top of that, the island was sold to American Army. So it's good we didn't get split and they didn't get annexed. Doesn't exactly answer the question. But the breakup of the Eastern Bloc and USSR affected capitalist countries on the other side of Iron Curtain as well. We had a massive recession in Finland during the early 90s. Since USSR was an important business partner during Cold War and now it was gone. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button. See you next time.